Hi everybody. So this lecture is about section 1.4, and this is on, so we talked about simple random sampling. This will be another methods of sampling, assuming that you can't use simple random sampling. Um, so we'll talk about just how to obtain what's known as a stratified sample, a systematic sample, and a cluster sample. So um, let's look at objective one on obtaining a stratified sample, and this should say stratified, not cluster. Um, But a stratified sample is one that is obtained by separating the population into homogeneous, meaning the groups are basically the same, and you don't have two members of the population that are in the same group, so they're non-overlapping groups called strata, and then obtaining a random sample from each of the stratum, and the individuals within each stratum should be homogeneous or similar in some way. So as an example, let's say in 2008, the U.S. Senate had 47 Republicans, 41 Democrats, and 2 independents. The president wants to have a luncheon with 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats and 1 other. So we want to obtain a stratified sample in order to select members who will attend the luncheon. For example, in this case, you can't be both a Republican and a Democrat or other. So you could conduct a simple random sample within each group using a random number generator or pulling numbers out of a hat or something like that. The second method is a systematic sample, and this is a sample where you basically select every 10th individual from a population or every 13th individual from a population. In general, this will be the kth individual, where k means whether k will be 9 if it's the 9th individual or the 17 if it's the 17th individual. And the first individual selected is a random number between 1 and k. So, for example, if k is 10, the first individual should be somebody or something labeled between 1 and 10. So you might start with the number 5 or something like that, a number that's randomly selected. So as an example, a quality control engineer wants to obtain a systematic sample of 25 bottles coming off a filling machine to verify that the machine is working properly. And let's say you want to design a sampling technique that can be used to obtain a sample of 25 bottles. So you'd want to determine the population size and the total number of bottles you're going to draw off the line, determine the sample size n as desired, and then compute the total number of bottles divided by the number of samples you want, in other words, capital N divided by little n, and then round this down to the nearest integer, use that as the value of k, and then randomly select a number between 1 and k as the starting number, which we'll call p. And so the sample then would be you'd pull the pth bottle off the line, and then the p plus kth bottle, and then the p plus 2k bottle, etc., where p is the initial starting value between 1 and k is the gap between the samples. So for example, let's say that little n is determined to be 10, then p could be any number between 1 and 10, and then you'd want to choose every 10th bottle after that. So you'd maybe want to start with the 7th bottle, and then choose the 17th bottle, and then the 27th bottle, etc. The next type of sampling is called cluster sampling. And this is similar to stratified sampling in the sense that you break the data into sort of non-overlapping data sets. The difference is that you select everybody in a particular cluster, whereas with stratified sampling, you don't select everybody from a particular stratum, you select individuals. An example might be something where the administrator selects 10 classes from a school district and administers the survey to, again, all the students in those 10 classes, not just select individuals within those classes. So here's a diagram that will hopefully help you sort of distinguish between the different types of sampling. So this would be simple random sampling that we talked about in the last section. So again, you just have certain individuals are pulled out, and again, this should be random, otherwise you may get a bias in your sampling. With stratified sampling, again, you would break your groups into your individuals into 2 non-overlapping groups, and then again, you would only select certain individuals from each strata, again, not everybody from each strata. This would be systematic sampling, where you for example, you might start with the second person and then the fifth person, and then you would pick every fourth or third person after that. So you'd start with 2 and then go 3 more, and then 3 more, pick the 8th person, 3 more, pick the 11th person. And then with cluster sampling, you break the data up into clusters, and then again you select everybody from an individual cluster. So you might select this cluster and this cluster, and again these clusters should be selected at random. So you'd want to label each one of these clusters like cluster 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then maybe roll a dice or something to determine which cluster you're going to select. So the main difference between stratified sampling and clustered sampling, like I said, is stratified, you don't take everybody from each strata, you just take certain individuals, and then with cluster sampling, you take everybody from a given cluster. A convenient sample is one in which individuals in the sample are easily obtained. This might be done like over the phone or something like that. One disadvantage of a convenient sample is that it may not be completely unbiased. So for example, if you call people on a phone and ask them a question on a survey, unless your frame is only people with cell phones or phones, you may have individuals that don't own phones or something like that. An example of an error where this has occurred in the past is in I think during one of the presidential elections after World War II, a newspaper called a bunch of people and asked them who they thought the next president was going to be, and they printed the newspaper with the wrong individual who won, because it turned out the next day that the other candidate had won, because the people who actually owned the phones and things during this period were wealthier people, and they tended to be more Republicans, so it seemed as if the Republican candidate was going to win, when it was actually the Democratic candidate who won. There's a famous picture of I think Truman holding up a newspaper that says Dewey wins, and Dewey was the Republican candidate, and Truman was the winning Democratic candidate, President Truman. So in practice, one thing to keep in mind of most large-scale surveys obtain samples using a combination of techniques just presented, and things that you might have to take into account when you're doing sampling is cost. If you're surveying, like 1 million individuals, you may have to pay a survey company or something to actually conduct the surveys. And there might be, multi-stage sampling where you use multiple sampling techniques. So for example, Nielsen Research Company, which does monitors television programs and what people watch on TV and things like that. They place an electronic box on the TV within each household, and then the people meter measures what program is being watched in the household and who's watching it. And Nielsen selects the households to do the sampling in a 2-stage process. So stage 1 is Nielsen divides the country into geographic regions, so this would be like strata, and then the strata are typically city blocks in urban areas and geographic regions in rural areas, and about 600 strata are randomly selected, or 6,000 strata rather, and then Nielsen sends representatives to the selected strata and lists the households within the strata, and then the households are then randomly selected through a simple random sample. And then Nielsen sells this information obtained to television stations and companies, and these results are used to help determine prices for commercials. All right, well that wraps up section 1.4, and there's a lot more to sampling than what we talked about here. We're just sort of touching the tip of the iceberg, and actually conducting a sample or a survey can be time-consuming, expensive, and a complicated process, and all sorts of things can go wrong. So hopefully that gives you some idea of the different techniques we can use for sampling. So again, if you guys have any questions or anything about this lecture or anything else, don't be afraid to contact me. All right, bye.